Hi, and welcome back. This is lesson 2 on Uniquely You. We're going to be diving deeper into gene variations today. Um, Basically, we're going to learn what the term evolutionary mismatch means, determine the significance of gene variations in relation to health risk, and discover how we know which gene variations influence which diseases. So this is a question I often get, and I had before I kind of dove into this world. So, if evolution is supposed to make us better, why did these gene variations happen? And why do they seem to cause issues with our health? Well, basically, it's an evolutionary mismatch. And what that means is that over time, our genes have changed and to try and protect us. But our world has changed far quickly over the past 100 years than our genes have been able to keep up. So gene variations all have a reason behind them. Um, some we know and some we just aren't sure about quite yet, but they all have an evolutionary basis that was there to try and protect us from something. Some genes thicken the blood, which would have been really advantageous a couple 100 years ago when there was more of a risk of trauma and bleeding out. But today, there's less of a risk of having that kind of trauma occur. And that same gene variation may actually increase our risk of blood clots, which can, increase our risk of strokes and heart attacks. Um, there's a set of genes called the thrifty genes, which would have been, again, very advantageous to us a couple 100 years ago when food was a little more scarce and people had to go long intervals without food. And these genes help people hold on to their fat and body weight in times of famine. But today, with our 24-hour day access to food, it's just not that beneficial to us anymore. Um, and then there's a gene called an ApoE gene, which has gotten a lot of press lately. But if somebody has an ApoE4 version or variant, they have an increased risk of Alzheimer's and heart disease. But at the same time, they also have a decreased risk in severe bacterial infections. And again, a couple of 100 years ago, that would have been really beneficial because there would have been more of a risk of having bacterial infections occur than there would be of Alzheimer's and heart disease, which are more of diseases of aging. So you can see where there can be sort of a conflict within these genes. They're all there for a reason, and as we move forward in research and we continue to find out more and more about our genetics, we will learn about all the aspects of these genes, both the positive and what may seem like the negative at times. Now, here is a couple of pages from the 3x4 genetics report that I like to use. I really like this report because they only focus in on the genes that we can really truly know that there's research behind, that we can make those nutrition and lifestyle changes and they affect our health. They stay up to date on the research really well and are constantly adding new genes based on that research. And they also do a really good job of um, sort of tiering or putting into categories which genes are of higher risk to your health and which are lower risk to your health. And so basically, as I kind of talked about before, you get one gene copy from your mom and you get one from your dad. So depending on the genetic variations your parents have, you have one of four outcomes of each gene that can influence your health. The first outcome is what's called a no impact outcome. And those genes are in this gray color here on the left-hand side of the screen. And basically what that means, these genes are fully functioning as they should be in your body. No decrease in function in these genes at all. The next variation would be what's called a mixed variation. And that typically means that you get one gene variant from your mom and a different gene variant from your dad. And one of those variations is fully functioning, and the other variation could cause a slight decrease in function. And so when those two come together, they typically represent a low or a medium impact to your health, because they could be affecting the biochemistry in your body, but they may not either. So they have a low or medium impact, and that those color genes are in that kind of yellow green and the tealish color. And then the third type of possible gene outcome is when you get two variants from your mom and your dad, and they are both the variations that are at a higher risk of decreasing the function biochemistry wise. And so that's when you're going to have a high or a very high impact possibility on your overall health, because you have both, you definitely have both sets of gene variations and from each parent that is at a decreased function. So biochemistry wise, if I'm looking at symptoms or signs of your health, then I can kind of correlate those to your biochemistry to know what might not be triggering the way that it's optimally should. The fourth version is actually called a protective impact, and they're at the very, very, very top of this screen on the left-hand side. And usually there's between 2 to 4 on each person's report, and these are unique in the fact that they are gene variations that are different from the normal functioning of the gene, but they actually have a protective component to them. So they actually have a positive impact on your overall health. So those are kind of fun to point out as well. So just to kind of go over a little example, this is a kind of easy one to go through as far as kind of describing how this works. But one of the nutrients that this report looks at is caffeine, and how caffeine affects your overall health and well-being based on your genes. And so these are two different people's reports. That the one on the top that's color-coded purple, which means it's of higher impact on health, and this is actually my report. And so the caffeine is going to have these genes affect how I process caffeine. So I process caffeine very slowly. And so you can kind of see in this diagram this graph of how long it takes me to metabolize caffeine. It's a long time. So if I eat or drink caffeine, it takes me hours to kind of get it out of my system. So knowing that, I know that I can't really do caffeine after about noon or 1 o'clock, because if I do, then it's going to still be in my system when I'm trying to go to sleep at night, and could affect my ability to sleep. Now, on the flip side of that, on this lower half here in the kind of olive greenish color, this is somebody who is a very, very fast metabolizer of caffeine. And this is actually my husband. And so this is somebody that can eat or drink caffeine, and it hits their system really quick, and it burns through very, very fast. So this is somebody that could drink coffee or have a pop at like 8 o'clock at night, and it absolutely does not affect their sleep, because it burns through their system really, really quickly. And I can attest to that, because my husband is very, very much like that. So you can kind of see the difference between the two. Another avenue that I kind of look at when it comes to caffeine and the different ways that it affects somebody is, in the sports and nutrition realm. So caffeine is often used as a way to enhance athletic performance. And if you know that you're a slow metabolizer of caffeine, then you're going to have to time your caffeine out a little bit differently than somebody who's a fast metabolizer. So the timing of when you take that caffeine and when it's going to hit you during your training or your game or your race, it's going to be very, very different. So that is one good thing to know, and how I use this information. Another interesting point is there's been a lot of research that shows that people that metabolize caffeine very slowly, like myself, really, really shouldn't do high amounts of caffeine, because there's been research that shows that it can affect your heart. in a negative way. And so that's something I always like to point out, which on the flip side, if you're a very, very fast metabolizer of caffeine, the research has actually shown that having that caffeine can actually be a benefit to your heart. So, two different outcomes on how this caffeine and when to take it and how much to take it can affect your health, your well-being, just depending on how fast you metabolize it. One other thing that I also like to point out is if you're a very, very fast metabolizer of caffeine, but you're somebody who experiences a lot of anxiousness and anxiety, I often will point out that taking caffeine or drinking caffeine because it hits your bloodstream so quickly could be a source of causing some anxiety, jitteriness, and things like that. So just something good to point out and think about if you are somebody that experiences those things that it could be stemming from that coffee that you're drinking in the morning. And a few things that I often like to point out when I'm talking about the genetic reports is they are sign points. Genes are sign point. They tell us where to look and which questions to ask. They are not predictive or diagnostic. I cannot look at your genes and know wholeheartedly that you will get a certain disease or not. That's not what I do. But genes do help us understand where there might be inefficiencies in how you operate. And so sometimes they help us look in places that aren't quite so obvious. And then we can validate with any symptoms or signs or any issues you're having, maybe even some lab data that kind of clarifies where we can make some changes in your nutrition or lifestyle that can be a benefit to your health because we know biochemistry wise what's working and what's not. And most importantly, your genes are unique to you and no one else. So how do we know which gene variations influence which diseases? Well, there was the genome-wide association study, or GWAS, that helps us understand the role between gene variants and health or disease prevention. So basically, these studies scan markers across the complete set of DNA of many people, and they look for genetic variations associated with a particular disease. And then when they use this information, potentially detect, treat, and prevent disease. So the human genetic code was not mapped completely until 2003. And before that, none of this was possible. So since then, we have been on a fast trajectory of identifying genes in relation to disease states and formulating research to support nutrition, lifestyle, and pharmaceutical interventions. So here's a real quick simplified explanation on how the genome-wide association studies or the GWAS studies sort of work. So in these studies, the scientists look at a bunch of people with a particular trait or condition, and they looked at what SNPs were more common in those people. For example, if a study is looking for genetic causes of heart disease, they may look at thousands of SNPs in people both with and without heart disease. And if any SNPs stand out as being much more common in the people with heart disease than in the people without heart disease, then we can say that that SNP or that gene variation is associated with that disease. But just because a SNP is associated with the condition does not mean that it causes the condition. And many people may carry that SNP and never be affected with the condition, and many people may have the condition without carrying the SNP. Scientists often find the SNPs or the gene variations identified in the GWAS studies useful, not to predict the health of individual people, but to lead us to new locations in the genome to study. If a SNP is found more often in people with heart disease, perhaps because the SNP is closely linked to a gene that's important to heart health. In effect, it is guiding the research. So how can we apply this in nutrigenomics or nutritional genomics? Well, genomic testing is a mirror of our gene blueprint and provides the most individual insights into how our biochemistry is functioning. As humans, we basically operate the same way and utilize food in the same way. But sometimes the variations in our genes can change how the body operates and utilizes the food that we eat. The operating system can also be thrown off track by social and environmental factors, as well as insufficient nutrient intake. Food is the principal information source of the human operating system. So again, this is where I utilize your biochemistry based on your DNA results to understand where to look and what foods or lifestyle changes can help you be the best that you can possibly be. Nutrients and foods serve as messengers and tell our body what to do or how to respond. And so, if food is used as messengers to tell our body what to do, then what are you telling your body? The foods on the left are giving your body very different signals than the foods on the right. The foods on the left are telling your body to be inflamed. They're putting your detoxification system into overdrive and piling on the oxidative stress. The foods on the right are signaling your body that everything is fine. These foods are very anti inflammatory and are not putting extra stress on your body. They are actually giving your body the nutrient needs it needs to eliminate toxins and to keep your body running healthfully. So, if you are someone who genetically has an overactive inflammatory response or has gene variations in your detoxification genes, it's even more important to pay attention to what information you're telling your body with the food that you eat. Genomic testing fine tunes how much an individual needs of nutrients, not whether they need them or not. In no world is your genetic test going to tell me that you can eat all the junk food you want. Unfortunately, that's not the case, but it can tell us how much or how little of each nutrient you need to support your unique individual needs for health and vitality. Essentially, it is your complete guide to personalized health. So, in summary, all gene variations have an evolutionary reason behind them. Our world has changed drastically and quickly. We now have an evolutionary mismatch between how our genes have adapted a couple hundred years ago to keep us safe and healthy and where our current environment is. Genome-wide association studies are performed to help us determine the association between gene variation and disease states. We can use these gene variations as a guide, map, or blueprint to create a personalized approach biochemically for health and wellness. So that's the end of today's lesson. Next lesson, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into nature versus nurture and epigenetics, which is a huge component of why I do what I do. And we'll learn more about how all of that works. But basically, it's kind of the philosophy behind using nutrition and lifestyle adaptations to help in your health and vitality. And then we'll also go into what is a genetic test, and then also what isn't it. So thanks for coming in today, and we'll catch you next time.